Hi, this is Professor Robin Malloy, and you're listening to ADA Live.
Yo. All right, let's roll. Let's go.
Hi, everybody. On behalf of the Southeast ADA Center, the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University, and the ADA National Network, I want to welcome you to ADA Live. I'm Barry Whaley. I'm the project director at the Southeast ADA Center. Listening audience, if you have questions about the Americans with Disabilities Act, you can use our online forum anytime at adalive.org, or you can call the Southeast ADA Center at 404-541-9001. And remember, those calls are always free and confidential. The right to safe and accessible housing is especially important for people with disabilities, but it is also one of the most frustrating aspects of modern life because so few homes are accessible. In addition, housing laws can be quite complicated. Every year, the Southeast ADA Center receives hundreds of questions about housing rights, which are covered primarily by the Fair Housing Act, but also the ADA and other federal, state, and local law. Our guests for today's episode are Professor Robin Malloy, Professor of Law at Syracuse University, and Dr. Peter Blanck, Chairman of the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. Peter and Robin will talk about court cases involving housing rights, zoning laws, reasonable modification to housing policies, and related issues that affect the rights of people with disabilities to live in accessible homes and communities. So I want to welcome both Peter and Robin to the show, and Peter, I'll turn the conversation over to you.
Thank you, Barry, as usual. Professor Malloy, Robin, it's really a pleasure and an honor to have you with us. You are, in my opinion, among the national leaders in the area of the built environment and persons with disabilities. And you've done work across issues like zoning and land use and work with professionals and served yourself in state or county administrative positions. So welcome on behalf of all of us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Peter, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. So tell us a little bit about how you got interested in this area and how it led you to do what you're doing today.
Sure. There are probably three main factors that come into play that got me interested and keep me interested in this subject area of how disability intersects with land use, zoning, and real estate development. So I think something that a lot of people experience when they have young children is they start to realize that if they themselves do not have a disability, they start to realize the difficulty of maneuvering baby strollers and things like that when there are steps and narrow doorways, and they start thinking about this should be easier to access. And they start then identifying with some of these issues. The other was my mother, who had dementia and had to be moved from her house to assisted living and then into a nursing home. And while she was developing dementia and having difficulty maneuvering around and navigating her house, I realized that it wasn't only an issue in her house, but she couldn't visit my house, she couldn't visit her sister, she couldn't visit any of her children or any of her friends. And so then it became very clear that one person's disability, right, has implications to a whole network of activity and friends and a whole slew of connections that are important to a robust and meaningful social participation in the life of the community. So those were key elements that got me interested. A third element that's more pragmatic and practical is I served on a local zoning board of appeal for about 10 years as the vice chair of the zoning board. And we would get people coming in wanting to modify their houses with accessible ramps or decks or therapeutic swimming pools, expanding garages to accommodate accessible vehicles that need more space in order for the doors and things to open up properly, and the zoning board would turn them down, applying the typical zoning criteria. And it took a while to explain to them that the typical zoning criteria, it's the first step of analyzing the issue when someone comes and asks for an exception to the zoning codes. But the second step, then, if we're talking to a person who clearly is in front of us with a disability, maybe in a wheelchair or has letters from a doctor explaining a disability, then we have to go engage in another type of conversation and go through the criteria applicable to a reasonable accommodation or reasonable modification request. And so through the process of educating people on my own zoning board and then conducting education programs for other zoning boards, I found this was a really important area in which I could make a contribution. So those things all add up to my interest in the area and then how my research is spread out from there.
Well, you certainly have and are making a very important contribution to this area. For our listeners who are not lawyers, can you kind of frame out the legal landscape, the typical person? What do they need to know? Do they have to hire a lawyer? What are the laws that they're contending with? Is it all so complicated and so forth?
Well, I think that we first start with my focus is on land use and zoning. So I don't engage in the Fair Housing Act for the most part. I look at the ADA with respect to zoning requests, things like ramps in the front of a house, which may impose conflicts with the local zoning restrictions about where these ramps can be placed. We look at the size of decks, property lines. And so some of this is relatively straightforward. And if you're going in and asking for a permit to adjust the physical environment around your property, you do not need a lawyer. On the other hand, what I discovered sitting on a zoning board and making decisions when people came in is they oftentimes didn't really understand what was going on in the process, and they didn't realize that this is a legal process that will affect their property rights. And essentially, in almost every jurisdiction in the country, what you argue and present in that little local zoning office is what you have to carry forward in all of your eventual appeals. So you could be impacting dramatic rights without really very good guidance. When you go into the local zoning board, I found a lot of people came in without lawyers thinking, well, this is just the local town zoning office. And I know those people up there and it's no big deal. I'll just tell them what my difficulty is and they will, listen to me and grant what I'm asking. But in fact, they have legal criteria in the zoning code, in addition to whatever the criteria might be under the Americans with Disabilities Act. It can be more complicated than the typical homeowner, property owner would think. It's very important to create a legal record. And a legal record is making sure you have all the documents, photos, pictures, letters from doctors, letters from neighbors that address your property problem. It has to be in the file. People who come with lawyers, they come with a lot of documents and they create a file. People who haven't been coached by lawyers tend not to present the best information that will help them. So I think it's more complicated than it looks. And so you need a lawyer, or at least advice from a group that can provide you with insight on what to present in your case and give you maybe a checklist so that you're reasonably prepared to know what's going to happen in the hearing setting.
It's very interesting to hear you talk. There must be a very personal side to this as well. It's so individualized. And I wonder if there's also a kind of a conflict resolution side, if you get neighbors engaged in different interests or businesses versus houses, homes. Does that all play into this fabric of what you're dealing with?
Right. So let's put it into the context. So you want to add something to the exterior of your house because the zoning code is going to impact the exterior. So an outside ramp, expanding a deck so you can enjoy the backyard, putting in a therapeutic pool, things of that sort, right? So Things that are inside your house are going to be governed by a building code and a building code inspector. Things outside of the house on the property are going to be governed by the zoning code, and your neighbors have the legal right to come in at a public hearing where you'll have to present your request and comment on and present evidence that may favor their view of, in a particular case, not granting you a reasonable accommodation, right? So you come in and you say, I have a disability. Here's some evidence of what my disability is and why the thing I'm requesting is appropriate to be granted to me. And you're not necessarily thinking, well, your neighbors have a right to come in and say, well, I don't think this request is reasonable. I don't think this is necessary. I think what they're asking for will fundamentally alter the plan for our neighborhood, and therefore the reasonable accommodation should not be granted. And then should the officials on the zoning board, usually there's 5 or 7 officials, and they vote. If they should vote to say, well, after deliberation and careful review of everything that's been presented, we are going to grant a reasonable accommodation, your neighbor can appeal to court saying the zoning board was wrong. So it's a complicated environment in which a person with a disability has to be prepared to sort of negotiate with the local zoning officials, but also be prepared for their neighbors coming in and having a legal right to say that's not the right accommodation, or no accommodation should be granted. That's another thing I found in talking to people who call me up about zoning issues they're having, is confusion that I requested X as a reasonable accommodation, and they didn't give me that. They offered me Y. But I don't really want Y because X would be so much better. The fact is that if what they offered is reasonable, that's the accommodation. You don't get necessarily the accommodation you're requesting. And that's where your neighbors could also have a major impact. So maybe they don't have sufficient arguments to say, hey, don't grant an accommodation, because where it's appropriate, the accommodation is required to be given, or else it's, discrimination. So they come in and say, well, if you're going to give an accommodation, then it shouldn't be what they're asking for here. It should be something else, which we want to convince you would be reasonable enough. I'll give you one example where that comes in. So we'd have people who say, I need to add this ramp to the front door of my house. And we understand the ramp is quite long and it will get too close to the street line because there are setbacks. Most zoning codes would say, like, you have to have any part of your structure 20 or 30 feet setback from the road line or the sidewalk line. So this ramp would go out into that. A board might listen to the petition and say, okay, we're willing to grant the ramp as a reasonable accommodation, even though our zoning code says you're violating these setback restrictions about how far your structure can come out on the property line. So the person seeking the reasonable accommodation has a plan for, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get together with some of my friends and my relatives, and we've gone to the lumber shop and we're going to, make a nice, wooden ramp, and then maybe we'll paint it, right? And the zoning board is free to say, well, we're going to grant a ramp, but you're going to have to landscape it, and it's going to have to be made out of materials that cost you 3 times as much as what you're talking about. And you're going to have to do this because those are the requirements that apply in the neighborhood, that any additions or new structures must be consistent with the style, the materials, the color of the rest of your house. So you cannot have a ramp that you put together with 2x4s, no matter how nicely you make that ramp and how excellent your friends and relatives are at carpentry. These are things that are hard to maneuver and negotiate, and then people are oftentimes surprised that they can actually make me spend 3 times the amount of money that I think I need to spend for a ramp. But that's providing you with an accommodation, which isn't necessarily the one you requested.
It's very interesting. I certainly know very little compared to you, but I remember saying in jest one time about accessibility issues, quoting Robert Frost's poem that fences make good neighbors, but they may not always make good neighbors if it changes the complexion of the particular property, as you're saying. So we've talked about neighbors. Now, when the county is involved, or the city, say somebody uses a wheelchair and the county or city or locality decided not to put in a sidewalk, or not to put in curb cuts, or not to put in those elevated dots to help people with blindness to traverse, or not to put in hearing stop-walk signs. Are those zoning issues, or do they all come under the Americans with Disabilities Act or other laws?
They come under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or they might be under the Rehabilitation Act or the Fair Housing Act, but they intersect with issues of regulating land use and property, and therefore they come up within the context of zoning. This is one of the things where context is important, because some of these issues overlap with people who do housing law and work on the Fair Housing Act too, right? So there's overlap here, but they're also contextually, you're coming in, you're asking for that ramp or a deck or something of that sort, and you have to, in the first instance, go to the zoning board. So now you're in the context of the zoning board, and zoning law is applying to what you're trying to do, and you're then trying to show how the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to that, right? So it's contextual, and your sidewalk example is a good one, because I did have this problem about a year ago. A community in New York State, in sort of the Lake George area, called me up, some concerned citizens who had disabilities. The scenario was that they had broken up in sort of old, out-of-date sidewalks that needed to be repaired, right? They were seeking repair, and the town that they were in agreed that they were going to repair the sidewalks. So in order to do that, they had to rip out the old sidewalks. And at that juncture, they decided, well, we're not going to replace all the sidewalks because that's really expensive to have an ADA compliant sidewalk. So we're going to only replace some of the sidewalk, and then we're going to make ourselves seem noble by saying the sidewalks we don't replace, we're going to plant grass seeds. So we're going to expand green space. And it's unfortunate that there are parts of the community now that if you have difficulty with mobility, you won't be able to get around. I get this all the time. I got this in Syracuse, in surrounding neighborhoods. If we have to remove the snow from the sidewalks and that's expensive, then we're just going to rip the sidewalks up. Now, that may sound crazy, but nothing in the ADA requires a community to provide sidewalks. It only requires that if you do provide sidewalks, then you have to do all those things that Professor Blanck was talking about. You have to have curb cuts, and they have to have a certain width, and you have to comply with a variety of design elements. But you don't have to have sidewalks in the first instance. Now, a lot of times, sidewalks are built because a sidewalk requirement is linked to the federal funding for a street or a road. And so then it's coming under some other, you want the money for the street, we're implementing this best practices and making this accessible using, state or federal funds. But your typical community street sidewalk, there's no requirement for sidewalks. So I told this community, given that there is no requirement, then did they have any evidence of animus, or that, this whole idea of, we're not going to rebuild all the sidewalks was some intentional discrimination against people with disabilities? Because otherwise it's going to be extremely hard to deal with. And the one last thing maybe on this sidewalk example is sidewalks are actually complex, because under the Americans with Disabilities Act, they're facilities, and they're also part of program services and activities of local government. So it's facilities. When you build a new sidewalk, it has to be accessible to the greatest extent possible, right? And there is one defense. One defense is impracticability of making it more accessible. So that's a pretty strong rule that it has to be accessible. But as to things like maintaining the sidewalk or removing snow from sidewalks, then that's a program, service, or activity. And the government can respond, the local government can respond by saying, well, we can't remove the snow, or we can only remove snow from certain sidewalks because it would be an undue financial or administrative burden for us to be able to plow all of these sidewalks. You've got to deal with sidewalks in terms of facilities, alterations to facilities if you're sort of trying to update part of the sidewalk, and then as program services and activities if you're talking about maintaining them and keeping them clear so they can actually be used.
Say you have a beautiful city park, no federal funding, but it's not accessible to wheelchairs because it's just trails, and people with disabilities want to use it. Is that a zoning issue?
That would be a planning office issue. So zoning and planning are usually together at the local government. So you have planning office and zoning office that work together because zoning has to be done pursuant to a plan. So some of these things are only sort of partially zoning because it would be zoned for parkland. And so then the planning around how that park is arranged and set up and its accessibility would be a planning function. So both of those would come into what I'm doing. You would just be probably pursuing that more closely with the planning office and their decision making. Because it would be a program, service, or activity of the local government, it would have to be reasonably accessible. So I think you see this a lot in parks. If you go to community parks, state parks, national parks, where they now have designated and developed certain trails that are accessible, and they pave them or they put, boardwalk down, that some parts of the park and the natural wonders can be enjoyed by everyone, but they don't, make all the trails fully accessible. So that would apply at the local level as well, that if these parks need to be accessible, but they don't necessarily have to be completely accessible in all the same ways.
Mm-hmm. So for people with disabilities, many who have not experienced this yet, what are some of the most common issues that come up with regard to disability and zoning? You mentioned sidewalks and ramps and therapeutic pools. Are those typical of what you might see in your local neighborhood if this comes up?
To think about other things that maybe are a little more commercial, if we might take an example there. I had a woman who owned a motel in the suburbs of Denver, and during COVID, there weren't a lot of people traveling. So in order to make money on the motel, she arranged with some not-for-profit groups to get paid a set dollar amount per night to house homeless people in her hotel. When COVID ended, the town started to more strictly enforce their zoning code, which said, this was one of those, shall we put, very budget, low amenity hotels. It did not have a microwave, didn't come with a refrigerator or any of those sort of basic items. And they said, you cannot house people permanently in this type of living quarters, especially since she was taking families into an individual room. They wanted to argue that they had a right to run the hotel this way because the people had disabilities and they were protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I said, the first thing is, just because somebody is homeless, that doesn't necessarily mean they have a disability that would be protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then this is an example of there is a legitimate public interest in the government providing a safe environment in a hotel room for anybody, right? Not just people with disabilities, but to have families living in very small, cramped quarters with no ability to use any cooking devices or refrigerators, probably a legitimate exercise of local government authority to say that is not going to be permitted. So I thought their case was a difficult one for them to pursue because we have to be realistic here. And just because you can say, I have a disability, we still have other rules and constitutional requirements and rights and obligations to make sure that what is accessible is safe for everybody that has access to it. This is part of maybe your point of negotiating this space in zoning. I'll give you another example, which is a relatively recent case in the last year or so, pretty important case, which is the city of Grants Pass versus Johnson. It was a Supreme Court case. It's a 2024 case. Now, a lot of my property colleagues don't like the Grants Pass case because what Grants Pass decided was that local governments have the right to remove homeless people from parks and sidewalks and alleyways and can fine them or give them jail time for loitering or vagrancy or whatever their ordinance might have in it. And of course, there is a sympathetic element to the plight of homeless people, because if they don't have any property, where do they have a right to be? And I guess technically in our society, they don't have a right to be anywhere unless somebody provides charity to them. So the sort of general property view is this case is really problematic. Now, I've turned that around to saying it's actually a victory for people with disabilities, because the conflict in this case arose in the context of disabilities rights groups complaining and filing lawsuits against local governments because they were unable to navigate their communities in California and Washington and Oregon because there were endless homeless camps blocking all the sidewalks, and it was forcing people with mobility impairments to go out into the street in an unsafe environment and deal with traffic. So it actually took the conflict between people with disabilities rights and those who are advocates for the homeless to bring this issue to the forefront in the Supreme Court. And then one of my arguments, which I think is extremely unfortunate, right, is they want to turn it into, well, the people with disabilities rights, they should give up their rights in order to help the homeless. And that's not actually the issue. The issue is that homeless people need to be dealt with. We need to provide for them, and the government needs to come up with a way to do that that does not impinge on or infringe the rights of another group of people. So you can't just pass off our obligations to the homeless by saying we'll take it out of the rights of people with disabilities. You've got to treat them separately. And I think it's a victory then in recognizing that government can't do that. They have to try to solve two problems and make sidewalks available and accessible and find a way to deal with affordable housing so people don't have to live in the parks and on the street and be homeless. You can't put these two groups against each other. That's unfair and it's illegal.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So as the national leader in this area, what are you working on now, and where is this whole area going? What do you see as the coming opportunities and challenges?
It's amazing, and probably for some people, they don't realize the extent of this problem. A lot of local zoning officials still don't believe that the Americans with Disabilities Act apply to them. I've experienced this in smaller communities. I worked on two different cases in what I would presume are more sophisticated communities with legal offices for their land use and zoning departments down in Westchester, New York, and out in Long Island. We were trying to get accommodations to change aspects of our clients' housing, right? One needed a therapeutic pool added, and the other needed a rearrangement of driveways, and the zoning code prevented all of this. And we tried to convince them over and over again that they needed to consider the Americans with Disabilities Act, and they insisted that that had nothing to do with local zoning. And these were lawyers, so these were not non-lawyers acting in these. So they were lawyers, and they said had no application whatsoever. So we spent over a year with these two different local departments trying to convince them. And so in the end, they were convinced that they had to do something for us, but in their stubbornness, they refused to say they had to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act because that's federal law. Instead, they said, well, we'll just go back and grant you a variance under our local zoning law, and we're doing that to be nice to you, but we don't have to do it. And we said, well, we got the result we wanted for our clients, but we were actually quite surprised that they insisted that federal law didn't apply to their local zoning activity and that you couldn't take them to federal court. You had to go to state court. So those are issues that I'm continuing to work on. It's a new direction, is to look more at real estate transactions and how housing markets interact with the cost aspects of making things more accessible. Because pragmatically, disability law is full of economic considerations in terms of the kind of products that get developed, what developers are able and willing to do, and their economic exceptions to all kinds of requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So sort of trying to catalog, take these into account, think about how real estate development and transaction law can be addressed to make it easier to facilitate good design and good land development. Those are important areas to continue to work on, to simplify things, as sort of a medical model of disability, a social model of disability. And I think in the land use, zoning, and real estate context, there's a regulatory model of disability. And disability, in order to make sense for people in land use, zoning, and real estate development, have to understand it from a regulatory framework and how it impacts costs and where they can work to try and make adjustments and where they actually have to make the adjustments without any sort of financial back and forth. The regulatory aspect, I think, is ripe for a lot of development, and we can enhance progress in that area. I guess my bottom line, Peter, is that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make our built environment safe and easy to navigate by everyone, including people with disabilities, but by everyone. It's a big mistake not to encourage and educate people who are doing land use, zoning, and real estate transactions to be a part of this process. So often I get conversations with land use professionals that say disability rights people just come in and tell them they have to do this, they have to do that. And it's not how it's going to get done. I think we need to sit down and say, we all have to work together on this, and we may need to educate each other. Disability rights folks need to get some education about property rights and zoning process, and the land use and zoning people need to understand what is required under these various disability laws we have. So then we can work together to actually develop more accessible infrastructure across the built environment and make sure that we're talking about integrating people across all the connections in a community that make up the places and spaces where community life is lit.
Well, there you have it, folks. If you have any questions, go to this guy's website, and he has all the answers with regard to land use and zoning and disability. Robin, it's really been an extraordinary talk. You made things clear and you articulately stated the issues, and I want to thank you on behalf of our listeners and myself for those wonderful remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Peter. It's always a pleasure working with you and the whole group, the Burton Blatt Institute and everyone else, the Southeast Center. Thank you again, and I'm happy to share ideas with anyone. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to follow up. So thanks.
Thank you. Okay, friends, you heard that outstanding talk, and Robin again is available. Certainly he has a website if you have any questions about these issues. I'd like to turn it back to our host and director of all the ADA Live and Disability Rights Today programs, Barry Whaley.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Listeners, thank you for joining us for this episode. You can access all ADA Live episodes with archived audio, accessible transcripts, and resources at our website, adalive.org. You can listen to ADA Live on the SoundCloud channel. Search the SoundCloud channel at soundcloud.com/ADA Live. Download ADA Live to your mobile device From your podcast app, search for ADA Live. If you have questions about the Americans with Disabilities Act, you can use our online form anytime at adalive.org, or you can contact your regional ADA center at 1-800-949-4232. Those calls are free and confidential. ADA Live is a program of the Southeast ADA Center, the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University, and a collaboration with the Disability Employment Policy Rehabilitation Research and Training Center. Our producers, Celestia Razda, with Stacy Kernison, Mary Mortar, Marcia Schwanke, Chase Coleman, and me, I'm Barry Whaley. Our music is from Four Wheel City, the Movement for Improvement. We also invite you to tune into our companion podcast, Disability Rights Today, for in-depth discussions on important cases that shape disability rights in the Americans with Disabilities Act. You can learn more at disabilityrightstoday.org. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.
Helicopters over us. They watching. They don't want us to be a part of their city, man. They pull all these steps, man. All these curves you can't get over good, though. All these inaccessible stores. They don't want us here.